Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on NACO Authority Control and Identity Management, Evolving Strategies for a Changing Landscape. I'm Erin Elsie, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenters today are Michelle Durocher, John Riemer, and Joseph Nicholson. Michelle is the head of metadata management at the Harvard Library, and until most recently has also served for the last 4 years as acting head of metadata creation. She's a member of the Program for Cooperative Cataloging Policy Committee and the PCC's Identity Management in NACO Task Group. She is the coordinator for the PCC's ISNI pilot project, facilitating the involvement of a dozen PCC libraries within the ISNI platforms to experiment with identifier creation and identifier management for personal names and organizations. John is the head of the UCLA Library Cataloging and Metadata Center. Since 2009, he has served in a number of capacities on the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, including PCC Chair in 2010 and 2011. During this time, he has led an effort to expand the PCC scope to include both traditional MARC cataloging and digital library project metadata and new metadata roles. Most recently, he has chaired the PCC Task Group on Identity Management in NACO. And then we have Joseph, who is the metadata librarian at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where he coordinates authorities' workflows, metadata for digital projects, and original cataloging. Joseph holds an MLS and a BA degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He was previously a cataloger at Louisiana State University. Michelle, John, and Joseph bring much expertise to today's topic, and we are fortunate to have them with us. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for our presenters, please type them into the question box on your screen. We will have time for Q&A after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now we'll turn it over to John. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I wanted to start out by covering the environmental factors that are driving a change in emphasis from authority control to identity management, if not also a re-examination of how library staff expend energy in the area of authority data. To function in a linked data world, we will need for each and every entity to be differentiated and to have an identifier. Yet we currently fall considerably short of readiness. As of 2012, the LC-NACO name authority file contains only 30% of the total names reflected in WorldCat's bibliographic record access points. That's 9 million LC-NACO records compared to the 30 million total names in the WorldCat Identities Project. That means some 70% of names are represented only by text strings in bibliographic records. In digital library work, faced with getting the descriptive workload accomplished, it will often seem like taking on any authority work for more than the most selective portion of the names will seem out of the question. Every institution is likely to have local researchers and associated organizational units whose scholarly output it wishes to track. All those individuals need to have identifiers. Thanks to usage of the Virtual International Name Authority File, or VIAF, we are well aware of the existence of authority work being performed by other parties in separate files. If the intellectual work has already been performed by others, why should I need to replicate the data in the LCNAF to support my cataloging work? In providing identifiers to support conversion of MARC data to linked data, shouldn't I be able to cite identifiers from other files like ISNI? Some other files have the ability to search a list of names in batch mode and show the possible matches. That's much better and faster than the one at a time lookups. Let's look at undifferentiated personal names. 5 years ago, the PCC assessed the viability of undifferentiated personal name authority records. Basically, they were failed attempts to produce unique text strings, and as a result, multiple entities were lumped onto a single record. As such, they could not be shared with the VOF, since they could not be uniquely matched up with anything. 2 years ago, despite permission in RDA to create those records, the PCC stopped the practice and liberalized the use of subfield C to take any distinguishing bit of information to produce a unique text string and thus make an identifier possible and available for the entity. The second Jamie Ambrose heading here features one of the newer qualifiers. It puts a lot of pressure on a single field to load it up with everything needed to differentiate the entity from others. Couldn't the disambiguating information come from separate fields and be collocated on the fly by systems that are better at displaying the data? Even in those cases where the authorized heading text strings did successfully differentiate people, how informative was the result to users trying to make a selection? What if additional information from a separate data element or two could be juxtaposed in the displays? Let's look at the membership criteria for NACO work. If the most critical skills needed are the ability to distinguish different entities from each other with careful checking for duplication before creating a new identifier, would that mean less detailed training in heading construction would be needed and more people could participate in identity management work? It won't scale to have under 10% of our library community equipped to contribute authority data to shared files. It won't be practical to wait for some other library to create the identifiers that you need. There are signs that library-created authority data can be put to exciting new uses, some of them totally outside the library domain. One of them is leveraging authority data to harvest citations of scholarly output. The odds of success will be much higher if we rely on identifiers rather than on any carefully selected or constructed text string. In light of the developments we've been reviewing, the PCC's strategic plan for the past 3 years has included as one of its 4 main directions, providing leadership for this emerging change in emphasis from authority control to identity management. And that document includes these 3 action items. The PCC Task Group on Identity Management in NACO would like to offer these definitions. The first is authority control. In other words, finding a text string and I'm labeling it the preferred form. Identity management operates by differentiating entities by identifiers. We associate characterizing data with the identifier in displays. The actual name may or may not be a unique text string. In our task group, we have also been identifying use cases that highlight the newer uses being made of authority data. The next 4 slides take a look at what practical difference it makes to distinguish the authority control and identity management concepts. Note the very divergent instincts in the case of authors of theses and dissertations. In authority control, there's a great reluctance or hesitation to establish a form of name that has low odds of being the same one appearing later on monograph title pages or article author bylines. But from an identity management perspective, there's a strong desire to get an identifier registered for the researcher right away so that thorough tracking can be done of the person's output. If the text string has been preeminent until now, it is understandable that there is a desire to get its careful formulation right from the start. And all the more so when we are aware of the multiple copies of records that we have needed to keep synchronized. Let's look at death dates. Under authority control, there's a reluctance to supply death dates after open birth years in the heading for fear of imposing bibliographic file maintenance burdens on other institutions with copies of the records. From an identity management perspective, there's an incentive to record or point to any additional helpful information of interest or value to researchers. To a certain extent, our past authority practices are the product of the technology we had available to us. The main means of achieving precision and recall was the heading or the text string, and we loaded that one field up with any and all differentiated information that we had. But now we have identifiers that machines can rely on for providing precision and recall. Various data elements like dates, academic discipline, and institutional affiliations can remain separate and be brought together on the fly in displays to help searchers distinguish and identify. As these last several slides have demonstrated, there is a significant difference in outlook between the practitioners of the two concepts. With every entity needing an identifier in order to be uniquely distinguished, there is lots of work to do and a need for broad-scale involvement in the process. It won't work to wait around for others to create the identifiers that you need. Lastly, not all of the potential collaborators we could have will be found within the library domain. At this point, I want to turn the presentation over to Michelle Durocher, who will cover more of what our task group has been doing. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, John. So as you just heard from John, the Identity Management NACO Task Group has been exploring a pretty expansive range of concepts related to the nature and definition of identity management work in comparison with traditional name authority work. So as we turn our attention to what these concept shifts mean for real work done by catalogers, both manually and in batch, we're looking a lot at tool development, metadata workflows, data standards that help or hinder library metadata from interoperating well with metadata created in other expert communities, which, as John said, is clearly a priority for the PCC. So where do we begin? The rules that have guided library metadata practices have largely developed for decades in a library-centric context, but in recent years, many very smart people have been working on how these rules and practices need to change when we think about the context of library metadata on the open web. So as metadata practitioners, where do we begin with identity management? When we think about identifiers, especially those designed for use in linked data on the web, there are so many options. and I've put a few up on the screen here. There are open identifiers like ORCIDs and ISNIs. There are commercial ones like Scopus IDs, identifiers associated with databases like IMDb, or services like VIAF. And there are identifiers in domain-based social or scholarly networks. A key aspect of these different identifiers are also the stewardship models that make them accessible or not so accessible to metadata practitioners for enrichment and correction. For example, ORCID, for instance, that many of us know well in academic library contexts, it focuses heavily on a self-stewardship model where content creators themselves create and manage their identifiers, so it's not as accessible to librarians. So there's no single direction for identifier creation, but there are certain kinds of criteria that make the kinds of identifiers most useful for the work that librarians do. So for the PCC, we're focused on providing those opportunities for libraries to create the globally shared identifiers that John was talking about. Some of these characteristics are that they need to be discoverable and recognizable by others, stable and reliable and persistent. They also need to be reusable in flexible contexts. And equally important, and this is a big focus of the task group, we need an effective way for metadata practitioners to directly engage in the creation and management process of those identifiers. So we need tools. So why ISNI? The reason I have that header is that the PCC has begun a formal collaboration with ISNI, and even though there's no single right place to start with this identity management work, there is a very clear way forward now to support library catalogers in an ISNI context. So as John described, the PCC has embarked on this collaboration with ISNI and the task group to identify the means for creating identifiers in a new context. For those of you who may not be aware of ISNI, it's the International Standard Name Identifier. It's an ISO standard, and it's part of the family of identifiers that you all know well, like the ISBN and the ISSN, which, if you look at the transformative impact of those identifiers on the library community, I think ISNIs have an equally rich possibility for having that kind of transformative impact. So as a globally shared standard in use by many different industries and many different contexts, it's a great fit for libraries given ISNI's mission, and also given the uptake in many of our partner communities. So this collaboration makes a lot of sense for libraries. While ISNI may be somewhat new to many North American libraries, there's been growing library engagement within ISNI, most notably many national libraries in Europe, as well as parts of Asia and the Pacific. The Library of Congress also intends to integrate ISNIs within the LCNAF, which naturally raises questions of how NACO would engage with ISNI in the context of practitioner-based metadata workflows. So to help with answering some of these questions, the PCC's begun an ISNI pilot. This pilot project began in late July, and a cohort of PCC member libraries, those listed here, have begun working together and learning ISNI tools, their data policies, and the automated processes that are inherent in the ISNI database model, especially as they exist today, but also thinking about how they can be with input from libraries meeting in a more direct way the use cases that we bring to the table. So in the first quarter, which we just finished last month, we have largely spent that time through self-directed learning and experimentation, because the ISNI platform, although it comes with very nice documentation, it's largely in a different audience context. So as libraries begin to engage with ISNI, and part of what we're hoping to gain from the pilot is to develop the kind of roadmap that will help create the necessary training for libraries, the documentation, and identify some of the pain points with the existing ISNI model that libraries might help to inform what would be a better way to map to our own metadata workflows and get the fullest use of the metadata expertise that libraries can bring to the ISNI community, and for libraries to make the best use of ISNI. So in the second quarter, which we're in now, we are starting to branch out into some of these joint focus areas. And I've got on the screen the ISNI Pilot Wiki Home, which I'd encourage any of you who are interested to visit after the webinar. This will be part of the slides that get distributed. As we created this wiki space in the first quarter, along with some of the communication tools during the pilot, like peer-to-peer listservs and general communication listserv, this site, I think, will be a rich source of our learning, and as we aggregate some of the documentation that pilot members create for themselves and for each other, I think this site will really be a nice launching point for the larger PCC engagement within ISNI, which is part of the goal of the year-long pilot, is to come out on the end with that roadmap for broader engagement within ISNI for the PCC. So turning now for a moment to another very important task group initiative. Some of you may have heard this term NACO Lite. While some in the community may not like it, it seems to have stuck, at least for the time being, for us to use that label just in discussion of, well, what is NACO Lite and what do we need it to be? So essentially, we've been using this shorthand term to denote a different pathway, perhaps as part of NACO, but perhaps alongside it in a parallel mode for identity management. And the light part of the nickname is intended to refer to the intended lower barrier to entry for existing PCC members to go into this identity management track, or for new members, which we've said earlier is a real priority for the PCC. So some have asked, where do I sign up? So it's not quite a thing yet. The task group is working hard right now on making it real and determining what will that successful model look like to open up this identity management pathway to greater number of libraries, perhaps even to the extent that non-library practitioners who are part of the library information ecosystem can also participate here. Some of the goals definitely are just achieving that greater coverage of entities that John was talking about in his remarks, and really making use of the expert metadata that comes from other communities. We have a context of the manual matching and engagement that practitioners will need directly as well as the machine matching that we are increasingly reliant on just to get all the work done that we are called to do as libraries in contexts that are often very resource constrained relative to the information resources we're trying to describe for our user communities. So initially, when we first started talking about this NACO Lite track, we were thinking largely in the context of the LCNAF or creating a kind of parallel pathway as part of the PCC, perhaps a different program alongside NACO. And that's where the ISNI pilot idea kind of took hold and why we're experimenting in that direction. But there are other venues for this work to be shared and perhaps even practitioner settings that we can begin engaging in. And one of the newest ones we've just started exploring in the task group is Wikidata. So that's an active area of exploration. Probably we'll have a lot more to say about that in the coming months. But given that Wikidata, that's the Wild West for us, it's well outside the library context that we're almost accustomed to. We've got a lot to learn there, but we're bringing questions like the ones in the lower half of this slide. We're used to having to think about text string uniqueness, preferred labels, and we do work in a in a global environment with lots of different languages and scripts, and opportunities I think exist for optimizing some use of Wikidata especially I think in those multilingual settings. So a few of the thorny questions that the task group is actively discussing now and building into our ideas for how we would create either additional pilots or ways for experimentation. How rich does the data need to be to set up the initial identifier for an entity? Is this identity management track a progressive pathway to a richer identifier, or is it sometimes not in that kind of a model where provisional or preliminary has meaning, but rather you establish an identifier and it's used and reused in multiple contexts rather than this sense of an embryonic authority record? I think one of the really interesting questions is about data movement among communities. So when you think about practitioners needing to search for the existence of an identifier, how do we make that most efficient in the tools? Are we incorporating files into others or indexing them in a uniform way? Are we pointing between files? Is it an API-enabled context, or is it more of portal-type tools? So there's a lot to figure out here, and I think a lot of very interesting work that we'll be doing with systems partners, as well as internal to our own library context, building tools. So lastly, I just want to mention and put this link on the screen for a survey that the task group has just created to help gather some input from webinar attendees today and any colleagues that you also want to talk with about these topics. So this survey is primarily devoted to defining some questions that will help us figure out what this definition of a NACO Lite experiment might be and begin charting that course. So this will be obviously shared with the slide deck, and we'll also send the link out with the recording. So thank you very much. I'll turn it over to Joseph.
All right, it seems that I was talking into thin air, but nonetheless, I'm going to start again. You didn't miss anything. Everyone should be able to hear me now. So what I'm going to be talking about during this presentation is some of the ways that we've organized our NACO effort at UNC Charlotte and some of the techniques that we're using in order to generate records and compensate for a severe lack of trained staff to do the work. I'm not going to be necessarily recommending that others adopt these techniques such as they are. They're very imperfect solutions to a complex problem. Rather, what I hope to do is simply encourage some creative thinking about authority control issues in this rather strange interim period that we find ourselves in which identity management approaches have not yet displaced or become integrated with the traditional means of authority control that most of us are still using in libraries, this text string-centered authority record. I think my talk will also be an illustration of why NACO membership is difficult for some institutions, particularly smaller ones, and why the program may need to be adjusted in the way that John and Michelle were describing in order to bring in more participants and make the process of creating and submitting records simpler. So I'll start out with very basic things. NACO. NACO is, of course, the Name Authority Cooperative Program, or the PCC. It's a program through which libraries and other organizations around the world submit authority records for personal names, corporate bodies, geographical place names, series, and uniform titles to the name authority file. Organizations join NACO by undergoing training from a NACO trainer. That's usually more often than not nowadays delivered through webinars. When the training is complete, they're paired with a NACO liaison who reviews their work until they're deemed to be independent contributors. And at that point, they're held to a yearly contribution requirement. That's 200 records for ARL libraries, 100 records for smaller libraries. Now, John mentioned that there are 700 organizations participating currently. Some of them are listed on NACO website. They appear to be a fairly diverse group of participants. There are some public libraries, there are cultural heritage organizations, museums, vendors, but it does seem that larger libraries with fully staffed and technical services departments seem to predominate. The extremely labor-intensive and time-consuming nature of NACO record creation probably does mean that libraries of that sort are best suited for membership in NACO as it's presently constituted. Smaller libraries, meanwhile, may have difficulty contributing no matter how much they may want to or need to, and UNC Charlotte is a good example. So who are we? Outwardly, we would appear to be a fairly large institution. We have 84 full-time faculty and staff, recently added our 2 millionth volume, but this largeness conceals some inner weaknesses and liabilities. A few years ago, right before I came on board, there was a rather tumultuous reorganization of technical services that resulted in the loss of seasoned catalogers who'd been with us for a long time. At the same time, we migrated to a new ILS that had very limited authority control functionalities, no ability to save or create local authority records, which was one of the main methods the previous catalogers had been using for authority control in the past. And so when the reorg and the migration were over, we found ourselves with some really unmet authority control needs. Some of these were sort of traditional, the need to have distinctive name access points for local names in both our MARC records and our catalog, and also in our digital repository records. We also wanted to associate URIs, Uniform Resource Identifiers, with those entities for linked data applications in the future. NACO membership is one way to have that done. So we began training at the end of 2013, became fully fledged members early in 2014. But of the 4 people who were originally participating in the program, 1 left the organization, 2 are no longer in the same department and cannot contribute to the work. So I needed to figure out a way to enlist the help of people in my own immediate unit, special collections, since I couldn't shoulder the burden of creating these records all myself. And these people were a paraprofessional with some limited catalog maintenance experience, an undergraduate student worker who was very talented, intern who was with us one summer full-time. There was me, and then there was a group of graduate assistants, paraprofessionals, and 1 digital production librarian who were working on some oral histories interviews. None of these people you would describe as your typical NACO participant. None of them, with one exception, had any experience in MARC. So it seemed an unlikely group of people to be working with on NACO records at first. However, these people had been doing some things. They had been following some local authority control procedures that I'd put in place to ensure that we have distinctive access points for name entities in our digital repository records. We use a kind of NACO Lite approach and Google Docs spreadsheets. We do some research for the names, record forms of the names that we found in reference sources, establish a project form of the name. So I was wondering whether it might be possible to harvest or reuse some of this local authority data that was floating around for NACO records, and whether it might be possible to use some of the skills that the staff had developed in putting this data together for NACO records. In thinking about how to make use of these skills of these people, I had to confront some what I would call received or hidebound or maybe antediluvian ideas about how NACO work should be organized in a library that I brought with me from my previous job, where the program was organized along somewhat more conventional lines. And these are ideas like only professional cataloging librarians should create authority records, that authority record can only be done in a bibliographic utility like OCLC Connection, whereas in fact we could assemble it in another place and get it into MARC later, get it into OCLC Connection to submit it. Another of these ideas was that authority work is very solitary, non-collaborative work, where someone opens up a work form, fills it out, and completes it. And finally, that everyone participating in a NACO workflow should have, the same rough skill level. Well, the workflows I ultimately developed departed radically from those ideas. Rather than working with sets of polished authority records that have been produced by professional catalogers with the same level of skill, I'm working with what I like to think of as streams of authority data that I'm sort of funneling towards me. Some of the data in quite a rudimentary state, some of it in the MARC format, and some not at all. And rather than producing records on the one record, one cataloger model, we're using a more collaborative approach in which some people contribute bits of data to records that other people then bring to completion. So these are the sources of names for NACO records that I was able to scare up in my department. That's always a challenge for libraries, I think. We do, to my chagrin, create authority records for ETD names. I do feel that these names have been useful in the sense that they've allowed me to get the paraprofessional and the undergraduate student assistant to get their feet wet in authority control. Since then, the paraprofessional has moved on to more difficult NACO records with names that are coming from our manuscripts and cataloging workflow. And then there are two digital projects that are sources of names, and a mixture of undergraduate student assistants and graduate assistants and staff and one librarian create the data for these records. Training methods, I really didn't feel compelled to put everyone through the same rigorous degree of training. Rather, I followed a kind of just enough training philosophy in which I gave each person just enough training to do the particular part of the work they kindly consented to do. So for the undergraduate student assistant, that meant putting some examples of how to create a simple authority record in PowerPoint slides and some Word documentation. The paraprofessional, I did ask that she look at some of those training modules on the LC website, the one for creating NACO records for personal names and corporate bodies. For the oral history staff, I incorporated some of the documentation, the guidelines in the tool that I use to collect the data from them. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then I do a lot of reviewing and critiquing. So now I'll talk about some of the tools that we use to create records, starting from the simplest and most widely used. Like a lot of organizations, we rely heavily on OCLC Connection constant data, particularly for the simple records. It allows me to put together a template record with the fields and some of the data elements that we're going to use in these records. Then my undergraduate student assistant generates the authority record from the bib, slaps in the constant data, drops in a few pieces of controlled vocabulary that we've already put together for this process in a spreadsheet, does a little bit of names research on prior forms of name the entity may have used, and patches together a passable authority record in fairly short order. Some of the other tools that we've been using to put records together, spreadsheets, certainly OpenRefine, MARC XML templates, MARC Edit, and to a very limited extent, XSLT. I'll describe two of the projects in which we're using these tools and how we use them now. I mentioned a few slides ago that one of the main sources of NACO names in the last year in our department is an oral history project, we're digitizing oral histories of notable people in our community, people like civil rights leaders, cultural figures, politicians, and we're creating MODS records for these interviews for our digital repository. Those records are later harvested and transformed into MARC for our catalog. These people, these names tend to appear over and over in other resources that we catalog in special collections, so it seemed worthwhile to get records created for these people. The problem is that the people who were doing this work were not at all proficient in MARC or in cataloging of any kind. So I was wondering whether it would be possible as a kind of stopgap measure to grab some pieces of authority data from them in a more congenial format and then get it into MARC at a later stage. So I created a Google form. It's something we often use in libraries to gather survey data from people. This form has boxes and blanks that correspond to various MARC fields and subfields that I would like to create or collect data for. Things like the 100 field, the 370, the 374, the 670. I also collect bits of fixed field data via drop-down menus. It's easy to do that with this data because fixed field data is pretty static from record to record with usually just one difference. One of the advantages of the Google form is that you can incorporate instructions about how to format the data in the form itself, and you can also include links to resources that people might need to fill it out completely. And so for each name they encounter, the oral history staff fill out the form. The data is transferred to a Google Docs spreadsheet behind the scenes. I don't have to do anything to create it. It's spawned by the Google form process. And the spreadsheet has columns with for each of those blanks or boxes in the spreadsheet. So I download that periodically. I import it into OpenRefine, a tool for cleaning up data and transforming it. And at this point, I use a technique that a lot of us are using to transform spreadsheet metadata into metadata of various serializations and schema. And it involves creating a template record in the target metadata schema. In other words, the schema that you're going to be transforming the spreadsheet metadata into. In this case, it's MARC authorities format, MARC XML. So I've created this template record in Notepad. It includes elements that correspond to various fields and subfields that I'm collecting data for in the form. And what goes in the elements in the template record are not the literal metadata values themselves, but rather sandwiched inside this rather squishy JSON syntax, the titles of the columns in the spreadsheet that contain the data destined for those elements. And so what happens is I apply that template record during the export phase of this process from OpenRefine. And what OpenRefine yields is a new file of MARC authority records in MARC XML, one for each of the spreadsheet rows in that original spreadsheet, one for each form submission. I use a very simple XSLT to strip out some of the junk that accumulates in this file because of this process. Then I transform the file from MARC XML to MARC with MARC edit, and then I have a set of MARC authority records that I can import into OCLC Connection and submit them. This process of taking the form data to the OCLC Connection records takes about 5 to 7 minutes. You know, it's not as if I just send these off, you know, without looking at them at all. In fact, quite a bit of revision goes into these records. Sometimes it's quite heavy revisions, but on other occasions, I make only a few tweaks before submitting them. When I decide upon the 1XX form, which is often the same as what was submitted in the form initially, I record that data in a new column in the spreadsheet that I initially imported. The oral history staff have access to that spreadsheet. So they use that form in that column in all the MODS records they create for the oral histories. When we submit the MARC records for the oral histories to the catalog, then we submit the NACO records. So another project that we're using this same sort of technique on, it's another large digital project that involves many, many thousands of photographs of motorsports personalities and events. There are many, many rather well-known race car, stock car drivers in this collection, but very few of them have authority records, only the most famous. So we thought it would be useful to get some of these people into the NACO file. So I approached my NACO liaison, and he gave us the green light to go ahead with the project, even though these people don't have the sort of typical literary warrant that other names that are coming from bibliographic records in OCLC might. So what I did, we had been recording some bits of authority data in a Google Docs spreadsheet for this project. We were maintaining control of it in this spreadsheet, and it had some elements of authority data, things like forms of name, birthplace, death place. So I downloaded the spreadsheet, outfitted it with a couple of extra columns, used some drop-down menus to insert terms for field of activity and profession. And then I've been having student workers kind of work on this spreadsheet over a period of time when other work is slow. When the spreadsheet was completed, then I uploaded it into OpenRefine and put it through the same process that I just described. And this is a way of conjuring authority data, or rather MARC authority data, out of old bits and pieces of local authority data that had been hanging around. So the drawbacks of this process, and there are many, is that I spend a lot of time reviewing and reworking records. There are a lot of corrections to make, steep learning curve for participants. Setting up the process was extremely labor intensive, although now that it has been set up, it seems to be moving fairly smoothly without a lot of need for intervention from me. One thing that I am disappointed with is that we have been submitting too many personal names through this process. I would like to see us submit a greater diversity of names, corporate names, and place names. Perhaps that's coming. On the bright side, we have submitted over 1,000 records so far to the file since joining NACO. More recently, 80 to 90 using this form approach, and we've got 130 from the digital projects in the pipeline. In the future, what I would like to do is actually get some of those oral history staff doing the NACO work in MARC. I see the form approach as a kind of stepping stone to MARC, so that I can indoctrinate them in that. I would like to find more time to devote to my own records because I spend most of my time fixing others. But I don't think any of these approaches, any of these tactics can really compensate for having a full-time person in the department to devote time to authority control issues, and that seems unlikely at this point. So there are other tactics, other ways to become a productive member of NACO, and other ways to accelerate the process of NACO record creation that I'll talk about now. One of them is to join a funnel project. It's a good way for libraries that lack the wherewithal to meet the rigorous yearly requirements for record contributions. They can pool their resources with those of other libraries in their area. In a funnel project, one person at one of the libraries serves as the coordinator and oversees the training of members and the review and the submission of their records. It seems like it would be an administrative headache to set up, but quite valuable once it was. There are several funnel projects in the Midwest. In Alaska, sadly, there's not one in North Carolina. If anyone in my area is interested in setting one up, please contact me because I would be interested in discussing the possibility. Another prominent tool that you could use to speeden authority record creation is the Authority Toolkit, which was developed by Gary Strawn up at Northwestern University. It works with the OCLC Connection client. It allows you to harvest data from bibliographic records and move it into authority data records very swiftly, and then enter additional fields in those records through a kind of pop-up box wizard approach. It's a very simple tool to use. I've provided a URL where you can download it and find instructions about how to use it. John and Michelle in particular were talking about the possibility of a NACO Lite kind of approach that would relax the requirements for data in authority records and perhaps speed up the process of creating them. I just wanted to say that in some way, this approach is already available to those of us who are working under current NACO and RDA rules. Under AACR2, the main purpose of the authority record was that of differentiation. You were creating a heading, as we used to call them, in the 1XX field that would distinguish that entity from others like it, others in the file and others that might go in the file in the future. And then there was a bit of identifying information in the 670 fields. Now that with the advent of RDA, the purpose of the authority record expanded to that of identifying the entity in a much more holistic way. And we were given a battery of new RDA elements and MARC fields in which to do that identifying. Fields like the 370, the 371, the 373, and so on. But in fact, with few exceptions, most of those new elements are not core requirements. We don't have to record them. just because they're there. It could be that we could use an approach very similar to what we do in cataloging, in which we lavish a lot of bibliographic detail only on certain resources that seem to merit it. Could we use a similar approach with authority records? Though determining what entities are deserving of a high degree of detail is probably a subjective, ethically tricky area that's best left to catalogers' judgment, it would be useful to receive some guidance about what level of detail is necessary to get a kind of NACO standard record comparable to the CONSER standard record you might see. And anyway, I'm sort of Xing out the fields that conceivably could be omitted. But in fact, you know, the most demanding and time-consuming part of authority work is not adding these newer RDA data elements to records, but rather it's settling on the 1XX access point, doing the research needed to formulate the preferred name, adding qualifiers needed to create the authorized access point. And if in the future the identifier is going to take on the role of differentiating the entity from the text string, is the time that we spend formulating these text strings really warranted? Certainly text string identifiers have some continued validity in our systems, in browse searches, in our discovery systems, for instance. But the point still holds. The slowness and cumbersomeness of record creation process means that so many names escape the NACO net, as John made clear. Is there a way of speeding up and simplifying the process to capture more of these names? Is there a way of synchronizing NACO's work with other identity communities and bringing its work into closer alignment with linked data principles? Those are the matters that the PCC group that Michelle and John belong to has been tasked with exploring. And I think that those of us out in the NACO trenches look forward to the results of the group's work with great eagerness. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Joseph. That was really great. Overall, all three presenters, this has been a really interesting session. We do have a little bit of time for some questions. So attendees, if you have not done so, please be sure to type your questions into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. And Joseph, we'll start with one for you. On the form that you created for the oral histories, who is it that completes that form? Is it catalogers? And if it's not catalogers, are there any problems with the content that they enter?
Well, it's a mixture. It's not catalogers, most definitely. They're mainly oral histories, graduate assistants who are in the department for a semester or more. There's one digital production librarian who's not a cataloger who fills it out. But yes, the data that they supply is sometimes problematic and has to be revised. That's clear, I think.
And is it you that does all the revisions?
Yes, right.
Yeah.
And I would say, as I mentioned a few moments ago, I think in some cases, depending on who filled the form out, there's very little revision work to do, just a couple of tweaks. Occasionally more work is needed.
Mm-hmm. Great. And would you have any tips or suggestions for institutions that maybe don't have the same level of technology skills with the software that you were using and mentioned?
It's difficult to say. I mean, I suppose there are other ways that you could stage NACO work so that different people are working on the same record and within OCLC Connection, perhaps. I do think that this setup, this process that I described is pretty low tech. I don't think of myself as someone who has a great deal of technical skills or sophistication. I think it's something that most librarians and staff could easily learn to do. It doesn't require, you know, in-depth scripting. In fact, it's an avoidance of that.
So you don't have to be a skilled developer to.
No, I don't think you really do have to be a skilled developer. It helps to.
Great. And then we have another question about your project, is that what percentage of your time do you spend on revising the records?
Well, I spend most of my time now, since we've been doing this form approach and working with other people, I'm doing very little creation of records on my own, which is something I have mixed feelings about, and spending most of it working on other people's records. I think that was the question, how much time? And it's something that I fit in as catch can. I have a lot of other things to do. I'm sort of scrambling most of the time to get some records out.
All right, thank you. And this is a question I think is directed at all three. Has anyone in the pilot project talked to OCLC about their metadata refinery? Are these efforts being coordinated?
I'm not in touch with OCLC on that topic, but definitely very much in conversation with them about tool development in general and the need to have an integrated environment for catalogers to work with. They are the technical support for the ISNI database, as well as one of the founding members. And as people probably know, they're the central organization behind the creation of VIAF, in addition to all of the partners from which the data is harvested. So they're definitely thinking in this kind of, global and cross-domain environment. But I don't know about the role of the metadata refinery in terms of their portfolio of products.
Great, thank you. And then it looks like we do have one more question, and it's for Joseph. And how do you envision automating the process even more?
Well, the system that I've set up has been mainly designed to grab personal authority names. So I could create another form for corporate names. Another way would be to use approaches that other institutions have developed, for instance, to create an XSLT that will transform ProQuest metadata for ETDs and, set up a very basic authority record based on that ProQuest data. So those are possibilities.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Wanted to make a comment, if I can, about Joseph, your last point about NACO Lite and how there are a lot of data elements that maybe you could consider optional, but that when you get right down to it, that 1XX is really the time-consuming aspect sometimes where the research goes in. That's a heavy emphasis of the NACO Lite thinking, is how can we make that process less of the NACO Lite model. Not thinking of a preferred form of name, for instance, has been very liberating for those in the pilot. Yeah. Those who are working in ISNI see that as the biggest mental shift for catalogers, and the one that they say is, liberating, I guess is the word that comes to mind.
Yes.
All right, great, thank you. So we did have a couple more questions submitted at the end there, but we are out of time. Our presenters have kindly offered to answer these questions in writing, and those answers will be sent out to all of our attendees. So thank you all for being with us today. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form. If you could please take a few minutes to respond to those questions. The comments are very valuable and help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. The email will also include links to today's slides and recording, and you also have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance. That information will be included in the email. Thank you again to our presenters, Michelle, John, and Joseph. And thank you also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Wanda Jazzieri, Catherine Balick, Amanda Stone, and Jasly Coley from the ALCTS office. The support they provide make it possible for us to present these webinars. ALCTS has other continuing education events coming up. The winter and spring webinars will kick off on January 17th with a session on governance models for shared print collections. Please see the ALCTS website to register or find more information on these. And we also offer web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum will be on January 23rd, discussing consortial collection development. Check the website for information on these upcoming courses and discussions. Thank you again for joining us today. This will conclude our session.